This is, I believe, the 7th episode of Anagoge Podcast. And today we have a very special guest, John Vervaeke. And I will get to him in a minute. I'll just like to say a couple things. So first of all, the podcast has grown a bit lately, I think, especially because of my last episode with Jonathan Pajot, which has gotten quite popular. And so for those that are new to the podcast, I would encourage you to check previous conversations because a lot of them are just really good. So not only do you have to, you can wait for new podcasts, but I would encourage you to check the previous ones as well. And I'll also like to mention my Instagram page, which I share a lot of book reviews. And so if you use Instagram, make sure to follow me because it's great to actually interact with people. Because these podcasts, beyond the YouTube, when I publish them, there's no interaction whatsoever. So Instagram is cool so that I can meet people and I can talk with people. So coming back to this episode, this guest is very special because he actually inspired the name of the podcast. So I'm not sure if I actually talked about it directly, but Anagoge is the idea of a spiritual ascension, getting into contact with reality and the higher state of being. And I learned that from John, and that's greatly inspired me. And that's kind of what made me want to start the podcast and have good conversations and try to get to the bottom of things, basically. So hello, John. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hello, Tiago. It's great to be here. And I was wondering if perhaps that had been the case, that the name had come from, my mic was falling there. The name had come from Plato's notion of anagoge that I talked about in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So that's really cool. I guess I'm flattered, or I'm happy that that inspired you. That's really wonderful. So thank you for sharing that. That's really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, of course. So something that I wanted to get at is you've done your Dialogos series, and you have done a fair bit of them, which is quite impressive. And so I'd like you to, first of all, explore a bit of what that is. Like, how does that that differ from normal dialogue? And also, not only the definition of it, but I would like you to explore what have you learned from it, because you've talked with so many people, not only at the level, both at the level of new knowledge, like propositions that you have learned, but also from the experience itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Diego. I've been trying to, it's like participant observation, participating but learning from it at the same time, and trying to not just talk about it, but really practice and exemplify it. So you're exactly right. That's the intent. And thank you for sharing that you see that, because that means I'm at least making some progress towards realizing that goal. So Dialogos is the idea of really bringing back communion into communication. So Dialogos names a process that we can find ourselves, that we can participate in. The practice for getting into it, I call dialectic, from the Platonic tradition, not from Hegel's tradition. And dialectic is both something you practice individually and then something you practice with other people. But the main idea is what you're trying to do is to access other kinds of knowing in addition to propositional. So normally when we're going into discourse, we concentrate on our propositions and we're trying to get you to agree or potentially you'll disagree. And we're working at that level. And of course we have to do that. That's just communication. We need to communicate to do work and to, transmit information, etc. So I'm not trying to denigrate any of that. But the problem with that is that we tend to leave out the fact that we are also engaged in authentic relating, in a co-equal process of co-socialization, internalizing each other's perspectives. There's all this stuff going on. And that stuff going on is where a lot of not the semantic meaning of propositions, but the existential meaning in life is being cultivated. So trying to get people, especially into the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory knowing. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to integrate a process in which you have enhanced self-awareness through a mindfulness dimension that also is affording me having enhanced what Siegel calls mind sight into you, So I use my self-awareness and my mindset into you to better disclose myself to you, open myself up, so that I'm not just trying to send you a message, I'm trying to afford a mutually satisfying connection. And then hopefully your state of self-awareness enables you to become aware of what's happening in you, so you can share it with me. And so you can more appropriately shape your actions, because I've sort of disclosed to you what I am. And so you can see more deeply into me. And so you can shape what you're saying to more deeply reach into me. And what happens is, right, we start to resonate with each other. I start to see more deeply into you, and I change my behavior. So I'm reaching in and seeing more of who I am as I'm reaching into you to see more of you, who you are. And I coordinate those together so that I afford you being able to connect with me deeper. You reciprocate, and then that takes off. And what you get is you get like a distributed flow state. You get flow state between multiple people rather just than between an individual and the environment. And what that does is it activates and accesses and accentuates just the collective intelligence of that distributed cognition, and it bootstraps it up. And what you start to see is that if people turn that, so there's a lot of practices that are emerging that do that, but if people turn that onto an aspirational project of the aspiration to virtue and wisdom, then it moves into this. So that collective enhanced intelligence can actually, right, inspire and afford people to self-transcend and to aspire to wisdom. And that's what you see, of course, in the Platonic dialogues, because they're always talking about what is a particular virtue, what is courage, what is right, what is friendship, etc. And what I've learned from this is it's interesting how people from religious, non-religious backgrounds get into a state of reverence for the process. And the thing is, you get it. They sometimes call it the we space. Christopher Master Pietro in our work, we call it Geist or Logos, Dialogos. What happens is a Logos takes shapes. This dynamical system, this distributed flow state that's integrating individual cognition into distributed cognition and distributed cognition into individual cognition. It takes on a life of its own. And what's happening is you're getting to a place you couldn't get to on your own, as I am getting to a place that I couldn't get to on my own. And then we both feel that happening. It's like an arrow triangulating upward, and everybody feels something beyond them, like that they're part of, that they're participating in. And they start using very religious or spiritual language. They start to express reverence for the connectedness. And what happens is you get connected to yourself, you get connected to other people, and then you get connected to the Logos, this dynamical unfolding of intelligibility. And then what happens is the reverence kicks in, especially if people bring in this aspirational dimension, is they start to feel a sense of connection to sort of being and deeper aspects of reality. And to my mind, that seems to be, I mean, I'm talking more about the collective process. Like I said, dialectic has an internal individual aspect that has to be cultivated and developed too. But what I'm talking about now is very much what I think was happening in Neoplatonic dialectic, and it certainly is capturing a lot of what all these authentic discourse and authentic relating practices are, both what's emerging in them, but also I think the potential that they could reach towards. So I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That was perfect. And related to that, so something that I'd like to ask you about is, first of all, I think the term, while you popularize it, I think in the community, I see the term not taken as seriously as it should be. I see a lot of people think of it as like a good conversation. And obviously there are good conversations, but there's a deeper, more mindful, more virtuous aspect of it that has to be taken into consideration. And to take that final leap, I've often found it hard to do it in this format for two reasons. One of them is that it's not in person. And so there's always something that's lost in terms of communication and presence.
Yeah.
And the other thing is because when you're speaking to someone, at least in this type of format, you're also taking into account people who are listening.
Yeah.
And so you can't just have a conversation as if you're alone with a person, because some terms they won't be comprehensible to some people watching and stuff like that. So always in the back of your mind, you have to kind of have the conversation in a certain line. And so those two restrictions to me have made me, I think, not have as much of a good Dialogos as they could have been. And I'm wondering if you have encountered similar problems, and how do you try to fix it or make it better?
Yeah. So I agree with what you say. The term is being used very broadly, but I'm kind of, and I don't mean this from a position of superiority. I don't mean it at all. But I'm very sort of tolerant of that right now, because getting it out there, right, like people often have to have a sort of an imperfect image that they can aspire to. Dialogos is something you can't really understand until you've had some initial taste of it. And so I think of it more of a continuum where you have conversations that may be good, but then you have conversations that get into sort of mutual flow, and then you have conversations that are mutual flow and mutual disclosure. So you get a kind of love, you get philia, and then right. And so I think of it more as a continuum, and I'm happy if people like land somewhere on that continuum, because my hope is that as this gets more understood, it will draw. And I try to teach more and exemplify, and more people are doing this. And don't forget, I'm also talking to a lot of the people that are authoring these new practices, like Guy Senstock and Thomas and Elizabeth at Evolve, right? All that, right? And so I'm hoping that if this is the right word, the popular understanding will gradually be educated. That's my hope. So I thank you for saying that. I agree with you, but my attitude is the attitude of a teacher, right? Like it's the same thing when you start teaching like philosophy to somebody. They're not going to really get it at the beginning. They're just thinking, if they're just saying sort of wonderful things, they're doing philosophy, and you have to sorry, that sounds condescending, and I really don't mean it that way. I'm just using that as an analogy. But you have to let people. But what happens is they start, and this is something even Plato said, they don't really know why they're doing it or what they are doing until they're already being drawn into it. So that's my response to the first point you made. The second point I think is very significant. And so part of the way I've been trying to address that, which is something you've noted, is to try and have many different, dialogos, or at least somewhere on the dialogos continuum, with many different people that come at this from different degrees of familiarity with the terms and the work. And so I'm hoping that I can help to afford, but also participate, and this is already happening, in wider communities that are also crafting a lot of the bridging terms and the bridging language, so that when people come in, they may come on in this, because some people are saying that to me. They say, well, I listened to this one talk and I didn't quite get what you guys were talking about. Then I went over here and listened to this other conversation you had with somebody else, and and then I came back. And so Chris and Guy and Peter, right? We all, and Jordan Hall, and we all talk about like the meta dialogos, to try and pay attention to how the various dialogues are in a meta dialogue. They're all also talking to each other at this more hyper level. And so my hope, again, these are both hopes. My hope is that gets dynamic and complex in the good sense for people, so that they will be able to naturally find their way through. So instead of thinking of the audience out there as an obstacle, trying to think of it as a field that makes many different ways of talking about this possible, so that people will actually increase the points of access. Many of us carry I hope this helps as an analogy. Chris and I talked about this explicitly. We carry the model of like the Greek chorus. The audience is like the Greek chorus in a Greek play, they're the observers, and so there's the actors and they're doing their thing, but the chorus is there, and you keep the chorus in mind. And if you sort of frame it that way, it can actually help enhance the conversation.
That's brilliant. I haven't thought of that. That's very useful. And I do like this aspect of like of distribution across many different things, so that it kind of converges. And I'll hope we have time to. I want to get into this problem of accessibility, because I think it's a big problem.
It is.
But I want to touch on but I want to touch on some other things first. So maybe we'll get a bit to that later. So I've consumed a lot of your work, and
Thank you.
Something that's like in all of your work, you explain a lot of history, philosophy, psychology, CogSci, etc. But I rarely see an autobiographical element in it. Like, I know surprisingly little for how much I've watched your stuff. And I'm curious if you could touch a bit on your personal history in the sense of your intellectual developments in relationship to science and to religion. Like, how did you come about these topics, and maybe moments of kairos that really change your worldview?
Yeah. So I was brought up in, better way to put it, I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian world. Not only the nuclear family, but my extended family. And you know, I've tried to get a more adult reflection on that. There's things it did for me. It exposed me to symbolic thought, you know, the importance of ritual. And so I've tried to appreciate it. It introduced me to Jesus of Nazareth, and that has been an important relationship for me, as the relationship to Socrates or Siddhartha are. But it was ultimately a very traumatizing experience. So of course I didn't know that at the time, because that's the thing about when you're in that kind of situation, you don't realize it until you get out of, like, you're in trauma precisely because you're a kid that can't process things with a kid's mind, right? That is overwhelming, and it traumatized me, and it caused some very deep wounds that I'm still working on about how to properly connect to yourself, to other people in the world. That's why those three dimensions. One of the gifts, I suppose, was the trauma made me aware of how I didn't know this at that time. This is anachronistic, but you know how much those connections really matter to a meaningful life. And so eventually I just read a couple of books that blew me open. I read a science fiction book called Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, one of the masterpieces of what was called New Wave science fiction. And it just exposed me to alternative mythologies and philosophies. And it just blew me open. And then I read Fifth Business by Robertson Davies, and I was introduced to Jung. And then I read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Like, so very rapidly, I was like, boof, opened up. And so I left that religious worldview, but I left it in somebody who was angered by how it had harmed me. So I became sort of a militant, very militant sort of atheist, as many people do when they have been harmed by religion. Yeah. And so, and then I tried, you know, I sort of things settled down for me a bit, because what had happened was I went to university, and I was going to just I was originally sort of interested in political science because I was getting very aggressive about my views, which was consonant with the militant atheism. And I just happened to take a philosophy course, but I was interested in philosophy because of Hermann Hesse, right? And I met the figure of Socrates in a philosophy class, and it was like, that was a kairos for me. It was like, boom. And that's why I've spent the rest of my life trying to understand this man. It just blew me open. The books had broken that fundamentalist frame for me, but what I saw in Socrates was an alternative, positive, a better frame, a better way of framing things. And so, and the thing about Platonic philosophy, you can see why it was so suited to me. Platonic philosophy, Plato and Socrates were creating a philosophy that was progressively, I don't know how much this was deliberate, but it was progressively taking the place of the religion of ancient Greece. It was a philosophy that was replacing the worship of the Homeric gods, right? And that was part of the conflict it had. And so it was perfectly designed for somebody like me that was hungry to have those connections met, and but was trying to leave a fundamentalist religious orientation. So I got really sort of, right, powerfully, I fell in love with Socrates, and I fell in love with his cultivation of wisdom and virtue. But what happens, and this has been the case until very recently, this discipline, philia sophia, the love of wisdom, after that first course, stops talking about wisdom. It gets into problems of skepticism and what is knowledge and what is science and what is culture. What is good behavior? What's a good theory? Now, I found that independently valuable because, right, I just found that, oh, wow, this is really cool, right? I found that independently valuable, but the hunger I had for the cultivation of wisdom and self-transcendence that had been awoken in me in Socrates wasn't being met again. So much so that I was starting to consider just leaving the academic world. But what happened is, it was where I was living at the time, like literally 2 minutes away, there was a place called the Tai Chi and Meditation Center. And I decided, well, I still want to cultivate wisdom. And so I went there and I got introduced to Vipassana and Metta from the Buddhist tradition, Tai Chi Chuan from the Taoist tradition, Qi Kung from the Taoist tradition. And it was like, whoa. And so I mean this in both senses of the word, I pursued all of these things religiously and deeply because I found, and I started to see the transformation. Now, about that time, I'd finished like my MA in philosophy, and I was completely disillusioned with academic philosophy. And I left the university for like a year. And I just was into these practices, and I was a little bit stuck because I was trying to figure out, well, nobody's going to pay me to meditate and do Tai Chi. Turns out that down the road people will, but not at the time, right? But then what happened is I heard about, this new discipline, cognitive science. And how it was interdisciplinary. And I went back and I started to take it, and I started, this is the kind of science that would connect up with the transformation. And then what happened is cognitive science was in a process of changing. It was evolving from a computational mode into the 4E mode, the embodied, embedded, inactive, extended. And they were starting to talk about mindfulness. And I was starting to teach about mindfulness and starting to teach about wisdom in the psychology courses, because psychology was now talking about, and philosophy was now starting to talk about wisdom. And what happened is this kairos of these two came together for me. And then what happened is, when somebody who's had a huge intellectual influence on me, my colleague and friend, Evan Thompson, he was supposed to teach a course called Buddhism and Cognitive Science, and he couldn't teach it. And he said to them, well, John could teach that course. And I went in to teach that course, and I started to consider the possibility that something that had happened to me was happening to many people, and in some sense to the culture at large. And I started to build this argument about the meaning crisis and how we've lost wisdom and how we've lost these other ways of knowing and how we've lost rituals in the proper sense. And we've lost people that inspire us to aspire to self-transcendence. And my students ate this stuff up. And I was like, oh. And then I sort of recorded one version of that course, and I just put out a camera on it. It was horrible and rinky-dink, but it was still getting quite a few views. And then another student had gone through the course, and he came to me and he said, I'm a professional, videographer. My dad's a professional editor. We want to take this, what you've done, and make a much better version. And that became Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And along that way, I was doing all this work on relevance realization, intelligence, rationality, self-deception, wisdom within cognitive science, and it just all came together. And increasingly, I have moved back to a position I call non-theism, I think addresses the hunger that was originally lit in me when I left my religious framework. And I've seen many people, and I guess that's just lucky that my personal path is shareable enough with enough people that they're telling me they find it helpful and valuable. So I think that's sort of my spiritual intellectual biography. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. That was awesome. And so I've always wondered exactly what was your background in philosophy, because I knew you had some background, but I didn't quite understand how you got to CogSci. And so that did clarify it. And it's quite interesting how there was this such a heavy conversion of everything.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you described cognitive science, because that's exactly the way I felt when I was introduced to. I think I was introduced to you by you. Like I was introduced to it by you.
Right.
Maybe I've heard it in the past, but like I didn't know what was about exactly. But yeah, and I think in some parts of your story, I think that's a pretty common, common journey nowadays with our culture.
Very much. So I found out, and then as I did more demographic research with Chris, Master Pietro, and Philip Risovic, and Misovic, I should say. It's like, oh wow, this is the nuns, the NONES. This is a big thing, and more people are leaving, and more people are talking about how they've been traumatized by the religious upbringing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so something that I've been really trying to do. Well, I've been trying to do two things. One is a more selfish endeavor of trying to understand reality and trying to understand what religion is about and how to cultivate wisdom. But another aspect of it is more communal, in the sense that I want to transmit this to people. Mm-hmm. And there's two types of people that I really want to grab, which is, one is like the fundamentalists, religious people that are like very dogmatic in their thinking. They associate religion very much with the supernatural, a very cosmological view. And then there's the atheists that are just like, Dawkins type, whatever. So I really want to speak to those people. And I kind of want to, to the religious, I want to say that you have something of value, but there's different ways of interpreting it. Yeah. And to the atheists, I want to say that, well, first of all, your view is a bit incoherent depending on where the spectrum you are, but also you don't get religion. Like, you're criticizing something that you have no idea what you're talking about.
I agree with everything you're saying so far.
So I want to bring them together. But the problem is, when I interact with those types of people, I don't have, like, I kind of know what to say to kind of shift their thinking a little bit. But in the types of interactions that I have, I don't have infinite time. Yeah. And their worldviews are very hard to break into.
Yeah. And they're dependent on each other.
Exactly.
The atheists, the fundamentalists,
absolutely.
They're locked into a narrative of eternal opposition, mm-hmm. right? And they justify they justify each other's existence because each is the other's villain, right? So that they can be the hero in their story.
Exactly. And so what I'm wondering is, I've been having a tough time to transmit what I want to transmit, but in a compact form that is still, because I don't have the time to give them a 2-hour lecture, but also powerful enough so that they understand what I'm talking about and see the world a little bit different. But that has been difficult because it's hard to change people's worldviews. So I'm asking your help for it. So imagine that you have those two types of people, and you can give them a very short, condensed argument. I mean, it doesn't have to be argumentative, but try to see them where that middle ground is. So for those two types of people. So
things that have helped for me is to try and not engage directly in the religious doctrine, right? Because both of those groups will try to lock you into the propositions that must be affirmed, right? And so if that happens, then nothing's going to happen, because then, like I said, the narrative, it just gets locked into place, right? So typically what I do is I try to talk to people about wisdom and self-deception. Because the atheists they'll make all their arguments also. Well, that's I understand the stuff about science. I'm a scientist, but what do you do to make your to overcome self-deception in your own life? Science is about overcoming self-deception. Well, what do you practice in order to overcome self-deception in your own life? And typically they don't have a good answer. Typically they don't, but they know that they should, because science is about overcoming self-deception. They know that, and so when I ask them, when I make it a sort of existential challenge. Well, what do you do? So I don't so much make an argument. I ask them, well, what do you do in your life to overcome self-deception? And they'll, I'm very rational. Well, that's really interesting. I study rationality. What do you mean by rationality? And then I try for them, if I can even just get them to broaden the notion of rationality beyond just inferential argumentation, right? That to me that's the most that I sort of hope for in those interactions, because often what people will do is they'll go away and that's a Socratic moment, right? They'll think I should be more, right? This isn't about, right, just hammering and people's belief. It's about living a good life, and so I try to do that. And then the fundamentalists, they're also sort of again they have this notion of sin. And so, well, what do you mean by, disobedience to God? Oh, yeah, I get that. But what does that mean? How do you experience that? How does that, and that's interesting. That's very similar to what I talk about over here about how self-deception works, and right. And so, and try to get them out, where they're also, so I stay out of the knowledge arena, because that's where they want to keep themselves, because that's where they play the game. And I try to shift people. If the goal is to get them talking to you, because they're not going to talk to each other for a very long time, but to get each one to talk to you with respect, so that and if you're growing a group of people, a community like that, and they're both willing to talk, then connections will be formed and eventually possibly across, right? Because people have to move before they have to move in community before they will move in communication. And so for me, the most I hope for, and I would suggest to you the most you could reasonably hope for, is just to get both of them out of the knowledge arena and into the wisdom arena, the wisdom and meaning arena. And don't talk about meaning directly, because then the atheists will just, I give my life meaning, and they'll just sort of, I'm a Superman, and the fundamentalists, Jesus is the meaning of my life. So don't typically do that, but wisdom and overcoming self-deception, and what do you do in order to make sure you're not projecting onto other people, and that's what I've found has been helpful for me.
Right. Yeah, that's very insightful, and that's kind of what I realized when I found your work as well. Like the aspect of wisdom seems a really good bridging point.
Yeah.
And
I think it is the bridging point between science and spirituality. Yeah.
Right. Perfect. Okay, so I would like to bring a topic that I think is probably one of the things that I disagreed with you the most, and I'm going to
fair enough.
I'm going to first state your point of view, and then you can correct me if that was a bit misleading. So in a mystical experience, what you argue is that we should pay attention to its participatory role, and not specifically the propositions that one feels like they gained.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really valuable. And when I'm speaking to people, I really try to bring that notion of flow, of insight, because that makes the experience more intelligible. Because otherwise, people just think you're fucking nuts.
Totally.
So I think that's a really good approach. But I'm skeptical of totally discarding any possible propositional knowledge that you might get from these experiences. Because, for example, you mentioned that some people go to the experience and they might be religious, and then they say, "Oh, now I get it, and I've had this insight that there's no God," and there's vice versa. So an atheist comes to the experience, there is a God, and those are contradictory.
Yes.
So first of all, just because they're contradictory, that doesn't mean that one of them isn't right, because the experience has to be interpreted. It's not like you just get like the raw truth to it. And also, while I don't think you've made this explicitly, it kind of implicitly assumes that both happen at the same rate. And it's not quite the case from my experience, both from my experience of talking with a lot of this community. And also, I saw research presented, I think 2 years ago, on Breaking Convention in London, which is a psychedelic conference. And someone there did a really cool study, which was they got a bunch of people that didn't have a psychedelic experience, and they asked them where they were at in terms of their belief on philosophy of mind. So if they were materialists, dualists, or idealists. And unfortunately, didn't have psychism, but then some people had a mystical experience with psychedelic use, and then they asked them again. And what you predictably find is that a lot of people stop being materialists and they shift to dualism or idealism. And so there's clearly a bias towards, there's problems in calling it a religious view when you have a mystical experience, but something like it. I would say maybe something like recognizing the value of meaning and sacredness compared to a completely factual accounts of the world. And so I would like you to talk a little bit about that. If we truly should ignore all metaphysical speculation, and by metaphysical speculation, I don't mean, just believe something because you experience it. Like, I'm not saying you should take it at face value, but carefully analyze it, compare with other people, with other cultures, how these things have been talked about for millennia, stuff like that. So do you truly think that there is no place for propositional knowledge out of mystical experiences?
Okay, so said that way, there is a place for propositional knowledge, and I can see why I was probably unclear about that. I was really, so let me try and say what I think a little bit more, what I think, and say it a little bit more carefully. So the point, yes, there isn't an equal distribution between the people who say there is a God and there's no God. The point is there's no difference in what they can bring to bear to justify it, right? And so there's no way of, there's no, to my mind, there's no epistemic thing from within the experiences. Their experiences seem equal. And so the experience provides no more justification for this proposition rather than that proposition. So that's what I meant. I didn't mean to convey that it was sort of equal. Now, the thing you said about what happens is these people often move away from materialism. I think, I would agree with that. But again, let's take a look at the research. If you have people who have an experience under psychedelics, they will tend to describe ultimate reality in very impersonal terms, like the one or ultimate reality or the universe. Whereas if they tend to have it outside of psychedelic experience, they are much more prone to describing it in theistic terms. So again, there isn't even when people are moving away, the way they're participating in the perspectival transformations that they're undergoing significantly predict, right, the propositions, which means, I would say, that the propositions are probably therefore not being so much caused by a particular truth of reality, they're being caused by the state that you're in, because that seems to be what's predicting. It's like, it's like the old argument, if religion was primarily a way of directly knowing reality, we would expect religious affiliation to be very, equally distributed. But chances are you will have the religion of your parents, right? And so that's much more predictive of which religion you adopt than the structure of reality per se. And that's not an argument for atheism. I hope you see that. I'm just trying to say you have to be really careful. Now, but the point you made is a really legitimate one, that people move. And that I was trying to convey that in that sense of ontonormativity, that what is the same, and those are propositions I don't mean to exclude. People say, I'm somehow in touch with the really real. And I think that, and secondly, that connection is incredibly meaningful to me, and I'm willing to transform my life and my identity. And so insofar as those experiences give you propositions about like your phenomenological experience, your sense of connectedness, right? your sense of the meaning and value of your life. I think those propositions are valuable, and they should be considered as plausible candidates for truth, right? That they're people are making true statements. That people move away from materialism, yeah, I think that's going to be the case because, as I've argued in the series, the standard scientific worldview doesn't know how to talk about this stuff, so they have to move away from it in order to talk about it. But of course, what they move away from when they move away from materialism varies considerably. People move into dualisms, they move into panpsychism, they move into idealism, right? And some of them move into a non-dualism. So again, the movement away goes in a variety of directions. So I think you're right, and other people have pointed that out. I was, so I acknowledge that. I was too extreme in saying sort of ignore the propositional content. What a more cautious way of saying it is take seriously the propositional content that's a theory about, or at least maybe that's even too strong a word, but an attempt to provide a description for the processes of transformation. So if there's a kind of knowing thyself that has a propositional component in it that comes out of these experiences. And I want to acknowledge that as a real thing. And I think ontonormativity does entail a movement away from a strict adherence to a sort of reductive physicalist scientific worldview. Yeah, I acknowledge that as well. And so it does open people up to trying to come up with a better framework that reliably brings them back, both conceptually, but also existentially, emotionally, a better framework that brings them more reliably back to that sense of the really real.
Right.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very reasonable. I would put it in a bit stronger terms than you're putting it, because I think the variation in proposition doesn't necessarily make it false, even if there's variation, because there's different ways of interpreting that variation.
Sure.
But let's not get boggled down in that. But I do agree with what you said, and I think that's well put. So something I would like to explore is the ecology of practices, and I would like to bring some context to see where I'm coming from when I'm going to ask this question. So I started studying psychology and philosophy on my own. Like, I started discovering these topics. I was really interested. I started listening to lectures, podcasts, bought books that seemed cool. But after doing that for a while, I started to realize that, well, this is dangerous, because if I keep doing this, what I learn will be very selective, even if it's unconscious. And I'm gonna end up in a place that's very different than the place I want to reach. And so because of that, I joined the university, even though I had no plans to do anything with a degree, because I already had a career by that point.
Yes.
But so I joined the university to try to get a more formal education that wouldn't depend on my likes and what ideas I found good or stupid.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up is to make a parallel with your ecology of practices, because what happens is when you're selecting various technologies of spirituality from different cultures, you're kind of assuming a top view, and you look at it from above, and you say, this is useful and this is not. And so you kind of suffer, or you have the potential to suffer what I was trying to avoid.
Autodidactism.
So how do you avoid that when you're picking different things?
Well, first of all, there's both bottom up and top down constraints. The bottom up ones are to pay attention to design features that should be independent of your preferences. You should find bona fide evidence, either traditional evidence from a community, but also hopefully scientific evidence of the strengths and weaknesses of practices. And if you really like this practice, you better get aware of its weaknesses and find a complementary practice that has compensatory strengths, and so they can act as checks and balances. And so you need to do that. You need to have a layering of practices that correspond to the sort of different levels of knowing. You need to have practices that help to bridge between the kinds of knowing. So there's lots of what you might call objective design features that you can use good cognitive science, in order to try and put into your practice. Like, so I've been arguing, and there's lots of convergent evidence for this. Other people have been arguing, so I don't want to take sole credit, but that mindfulness and active open-mindedness have a complementary relationship. And you should not be, I'll be strong on this, you should not be practicing one without practicing the other, because you need that checks and balance. And that was in the paper that I published with Leo in 2013 about the cognitive science of relevance, meaning, and wisdom. And so there are, bottom up, there are objective design features that should prevent you from just following your untutored preferences in how you choose your practices. Now, the thing is, you also have to choose practices that take. So you're trying to get this sort of middle path between just imposing something on yourself and also just self-indulging, right? It's the Buddhist path, right? You don't just impose on yourself in the forest and in asceticism, and you don't just give in to yourself in the palace, right? You're trying to find in between. The top down is exactly what we were talking about earlier. I think of Dialogos, and Dialogos requires a pedagogical program. There's a bunch of practices you have to practice in sequence to get to the place where you can do it well. But I see Dialogos as giving us the collective rationality, perhaps even the collective wisdom at distributed cognition that can act as a guide for us, a normative guide for us, like, the community of the church did for people, that can act as a normative guide to us when we curate and coordinate our individual and also group ecologies of practices. So the idea is there's bottom-up design constraints, and then there's top-down constraints from the meta-psychotechnology, that's what Jordan Hall calls it, the meta-psychotechnology of Dialogos. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, that's pretty much what's worked for us in the past, right? We had bottom-up design features, and then we had a top-down distributed cognition machine of some kind that acted as, the space of affordance and the space of vetting as people tried to curate their individual or familial spiritual lives.
Mm-hmm. That's perfect. I just remember that, this problem of selection has been salient to me for a long time, but yeah. I only really felt it deep in my soul a while back when reading Augustine. And yeah. I'm going to butcher what he said a little bit, but I believe the meaning is correct. Like, he said something like, if you follow the gospel, but you follow only the parts you don't like, you're not following the gospel, you're following yourself.
Yes.
And when I read that, and taking into account my background of philosophy and psychology, I was like, whoa, and that has its problems. It can become dogmatic.
Yeah, and it can become really harmful to people too.
Absolutely. Yep. But that really made me salient. And I loved how you connected to Dialogos, because I think I don't really know how to explain it too well without sounding a bit crazy, but I do understand what you were getting at, and I didn't quite think of it in those terms. Now, in terms of analyzing the practices, in terms, there's a traditional element. So some practices have been done forever. But then there's also a science element. So cognitive science has been very interested in ritual and the wisdom behind the technologies that religion employs. And I think that's a useful framework. But the problem that I have with that is that science is always behind, because if you were in that position that you're now of evaluating the science of those technologies, if you were doing that 50 or 100 years ago, like, you wouldn't be able to understand what they were about.
Yep. I think that's true. I think it goes the other way too. Religion's always behind too, because you see religions changing themselves to take into account for what science is doing. What happens in the history of Protestantism is it moves towards a very Cartesian model of Christianity through its history, right? And so I think they're both behind each other in important ways. And so just like I really share with you the concern about autodidactism, I could share with you that concern. And it's analogous to what happens in cognitive science, because often, in some ways, philosophy is ahead of psychology, but in other ways, psychology is ahead of philosophy. So it's a problem that I'm very familiar with. And so trying to create, that's why I also put emphasis on these bridging practices that allow these different, so that they can catch each other up, right? So that they can mutually inspire insight and transformation in each other. I mean, that's one way, if you had to put it in a slogan, and what I'm trying to do with science and spirituality. I'm trying to craft something that allows them to catch each other up. And so the one amendment I would make is, I think the being out of sync goes both ways. And then it seems to me that the best way to address that is, well, what can I build in between that will help them catch each other up as much as possible? And other people are doing that. That is not solely my project by any means. And what's happening is I'm seeing the more they talk to each other, I'm seeing on the CogSci, really ramp up, right? It's really been moving very fast in the last 2 decades, which is fast for science, right? And I'm starting to see people much more open within spirituality to cognitive science. Jonathan Pajot, good friend, right? And you had him on here. Jonathan, by his own admission, he said he used to be sort of hostile to the scientific worldview. But as he's seen some of the things from 4E cognitive science, he says he's now more open. And he and I have genuinely good Dialogos together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And same thing with Paul Vanderklay and Mary Cohen and J.P. Marceau, right? And these are all committed Christians, but their attitude towards and I don't mean to be condescending, but I think they're getting sort of caught up on the science. And then on the other side, I see the cognitive scientists, because of the work that I do and Evan Thompson does and Dreyfus, like this whole host of people, Gallagher, right? Like all of that stuff, they're also getting caught up to the spirituality. And, I was last year, I was, we got all of the well, not all of them, but most of the experts on the psychology of wisdom together, and we hung out in a room for 10 hours and banged away, and then we worked on it, and we published it's published in the high impact journal, Psychological Science, a consensus paper on the psychology of wisdom. Like that wouldn't have been possible even 5 years ago. Right. But it's happened, and it's there. That's happening. So I take seriously what you're saying, but I guess I'm a little bit more hopeful, because I'm seeing more of the moments of the sparking of synchronicity between the two, or maybe synergism is a better word. Yeah, not synchronicity, synergism between the two, and that is making me more hopeful. I think that problem is like one of the core issues is how do we get them to talk to each other so that they catch each other up, almost like friends who haven't seen each other for a while.
Exactly. That was perfect, and that does make me a bit more optimistic, and I do like the mutual catching up. I think that's a really good way to put it. So something that I would like to bring up is that you have introduced a lot of really helpful and powerful conceptual vocabulary. So a lot of times you use older words, tracking their etymology to try to recuperate their original meaning, so that we don't have the associations with the modern words. And also sometimes you make new words to try to convey a meaning that otherwise would be very difficult to transmit in a short manner. But the problem with that conceptual vocabulary is that it becomes increasingly abstract and increasingly distant. And so because I've consumed so much of your work, I'm very familiar with your vocabulary. But if I send some of your videos to, regular friends and pretty smart people, a lot of them will get lost, and even when you have the dialogos with other people, if it's people that I'm not familiar with their work at all, it's also hard to follow. And so there's this problem that you need the vocabulary, because otherwise it's meaning that it's very hard to transmit. But also it's increasingly distant, increasingly abstract. And from my understanding, part of what religion mythology used to do is that it brings all this meaning of really high-end philosophy and theology, and it condenses it into a narrative that it can be understood by the lower level of people. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but they understand the philosophy and the theology by the story without needing this really abstract stuff. But we lost that now because we can't understand stories as they're meant to be understood. So how do you fix that? Because we need the meaning and the power, but it has this consequence.
And I'm really respectful of that question, because that's a criticism that Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Pajot have made. Also, some of the work debate within affection that I'm having with Mary and Mark Lefebvre and others about their proposal for parabolic knowing, which is, I still have sort of scientific criticisms of that as a scientific proposal. But I've been trying to also understand the intent, and the intent, I think, is coming more and more clear to me. It's doing exactly what you say. And this is really on sort of the cutting edge of my thinking on this problem, because it's something I'm currently wrestling with. So perhaps a little bit of charity on your part if I struggle a bit and a little bit incoherent.
Of course.
But the thing that's helping me, and something that I talked about when I talked about Corbin and the meaning series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, and when I talked to Thomas Cheetham, because I read his book on Corbin, and Corbin's notion of the imaginal, which is not the same thing as mental image. The imaginal is so compare imagining a sailboat to a child putting on a cape, like a blanket, and jumping off and pretending that they're Superman. They don't have an image in their head. They're actually enacting a way of relating to themselves in the world. That's the imaginal, as opposed to in your head, which is just the imaginary. Does that sort of track as a distinction? So there's a difference between, creating a mental picture and pretending a certain way in reality, right? And so that's what I often call serious play. That's what Corbin means by the imaginal. He means that kind of real serious play, the kind of enacted imagery that we do when we talk about somebody engaged in pretending, make believe, and listen to those phrases, man. Pretending, attending to it ahead of time, right? Tending to it, making believe, right? And so the imaginal is exactly that, and its job is to bridge between the sensual, sense experience, and the conceptual. Its job, and his big criticism, and what he saw in Persian Sufism, was that Persian Sufism properly understood the central mediating role of the imaginal, and that without the imaginal, the conceptual and the sensual, and Corbin's criticism, which I didn't make clear enough in the series, was that another one of the Cartesian divisions is we've divided the world into the empirical or the rational. It's just sensual or it's just conceptual. And then Romanticism tried to do the imaginal, but it got really mixed up in a lot of crazy ways. And so Corbin is trying to sort of recuperate and restructure Romanticism and then integrate it with imaginal practices from the Neoplatonic traditions, especially within Sufism, and try to say, and that's what he means by angels. It's this imaginal realm, not imaginary, right? So the imaginal takes place in what I call the transjective, that which binds the subjective and the objective this way, but the imaginal also binds the sensual and the conceptual together. And so I think of religions as like imaginal augmented reality, like the way we can take virtual reality and impose it on real reality, physical reality, so that we can see physical reality better. We can pretend through it so we actually get better at interacting with reality. So think of something very non-controversial. You have the heads-up display in the fighter pilot. He's got all this stuff on his window screen that's not actually coming from the environment, right? It's imaginal because he's looking through it and it helps him see things that he wouldn't otherwise see. That's what I mean. That's what we mean by augmented reality. And I think religions are imaginal augmentations of reality. And what's missing in my work, but partially because of neglect and ignorance, and partially because of I don't have the expertise, is right the creation of the imaginal that not only bridges between the subjective and the objective, but bridges between the sensual and the conceptual. And I think Corbin is right that's, and you try to hear this word other than just through the romantic years, that's properly the role of art. And I'm not an artist. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not. I mean, I've been writing poetry for a couple of decades, so I think I wouldn't try and publish any of it or anything like that, but people tell me it's fairly good, at least at a personal level. All I mean by that is I think I got an understanding of that as an art form, but so I've been trying to encourage people, and people do. They send me works of art, or Akira the Dawn is doing the meaning wave, where he's putting the entire Meaning Crisis series to music and live performance, right? He's doing that pretense. He's doing augmented reality. He's doing the enacted imaginal. I can't do it, but he's doing it. And people can do what you said. People that otherwise couldn't get into my work are getting into the work. And so I can't do it because I'm not the right person for the job. What I can do is talk about how I can do what I do, which is talk about the theory of why it's needed and point to people like Corbin and others. But I mean, and I can keep acknowledging that this needs to be done more, but I'm not the person to actually do it. What I can do is, so I'm receptive when people say, I'm looking at a painting that somebody sent me, right? When they sent, and I'm receptive and I'm encouraging. And when Akira approached me, I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I'm a little bit at a loss of what more I should be doing to try and, increase the affordance of the generation of the imaginal. But that's what's needed. That's exactly what's needed.
That was perfect, and I really, the imaginal subject, I really appreciate it, because I've heard it before on your series, but I understood it better now. Yeah. And I have a hard time imagining how that would actually look like, but I do understand that it's something it's going to take time, and it's beyond your expertise, and it's still new, and something very complicated. So, if I had to talk with anyone on Earth for a long time, I think that would be you. So it's very surreal to have this conversation with you. And so I can talk basically forever, but I want to be respectful of your time. So I have one last question. And maybe it's a big question, but what I would like to know, at least for you to explore a bit, is how exactly did you get so educated? Because your knowledge, to me, is just insane. Because it's not only that you know cognitive science, and you don't just know philosophy. Like, you have a rich contextual knowledge of everything together, and you've read so much. And I'm trying to emulate that, but to me, it just doesn't look realistic at all. So if you could touch a bit on how exactly did you get to that point, and also I would like for you to recommend an academic path to get to where you are now, because I'm in my last year of psychology and philosophy now, and I'm kind of not sure exactly where to go for a master's, if I should try to get into CogSci, if I want to get to philosophy, because there's so many topics and they're so independent and they all seem important, and I'm kind of overwhelmed which path to go. So if you could explore that a bit, that would be fantastic.
So, I mean, I was very privileged in that the circumstances and people in my life and I went to university for like 17 years. So, because I got a BA, a BSc, an MA, and a PhD. And I'm not going to recommend that to other people. I'm just not going to do that. That's not fair to anybody. I understand that was very idiosyncratic for me. But one of the things that I did learn, also because I was in cognitive science and cognitive psychology, I learned how to learn, and I learned how to read in a very powerful way, I think. But it's also that reading became, and I mean this seriously, I read religiously, right? So, for example, one of the practices I do is I'll read quartets of books. I'll pick 4 books that are sort of, to my mind, they're sort of in a family together. They sort of speak to each other. They talk to, and I read them in parallel, which initially is harder to do. People I'll read this book and then this book. But when you read in parallel, initially it's harder. But as you do that, and if you do it deliberately and you choose it, what happens is the books start to talk to each other. And you start to, that really starts to draw you, and you get deeper into each book because of the other 3 that it's around. You build this positive manifold, and they speak to each other, and they correct each other. and they draw you in more powerfully, and you get more. And what happens is, as your sort of boredom machinery kicks in, you can just move around the quartet and reinterest yourself and renew your interest in a powerful way. And so what I have quartets, and then I'll have sort of quartets of quartets around different topics and areas. And so, and then I don't just read a book, I interact with it. That's why, for me, the book has to be a physical thing. Write in a book, mark in it. The margins were there to write it. That's what they're there for. That's why we have margins. The margins aren't like, that's why we have margins. The margins are there so you can write things in. And you write things, and there's often pieces of paper, empty pages at the end of a book. They're there for you to write things in, to interact with the book. And if you have the quartets, they help you generate questions for the text you're reading. You're reading this other text, and you can ask questions. Write the question down. Maybe the answer will be 2 pages later. Note that. But get into a dialogical relationship with the individual text, and reading in quartet will also help you dialogue with each book. That's what really helps me.
That sounds very hard.
It's hard.
Incredibly hard.
But it's like a martial art. Like if you said to me, well, I noticed you're like a black belt. I'm like, well, like, how do you do that? And it's like, well, and it looks so easy. And it's like, well, initially it's harder than what you normally do, right? But if you want to get to a play, but what I can tell you is, if you practice it, and you practice it religiously, you'll get to a place where it goes from being something that you're pushing to something that is pulling you along.
Right. Awesome. And also, could you also give some insight to people that kind of want to get to where you are, of like an intersection of, spirituality and science and the academic path to get there? What do you think people should prioritize?
I mean, I want to be cautious here, because egocentric bias is clearly acting. So take that into account. So let's just have a moment so you really take what I just said. Because I'm going to say this. I think 4E, cognitive science, is the best place to get the academic training if you want to bridge between science and spirituality. I genuinely believe that. Okay,
that's good to hear, because I just spent $50 on the new textbook today. So perfect. That's kind of where I was leaning as well. But the problem is I'm not very good at math. And because CogSci is associated with artificial intelligence, a lot of programs have a lot of math, and that kind of scares me a little bit.
Yeah, but usually, I mean, the one at U of T, we have 2 streams. Well, no, so we have 5 streams. I made a mistake. But 2 of those streams are in sort of science. You'll come out of it with a BSc, and they emphasize math. But we also have 3 streams that you'll come out with a BA, because they emphasize psychology or philosophy more. So you can look around. There are variations in the programs, and you can look around for programs, and especially like who your supervisor is going to be, about how you're going to steer yourself, whether or not you need to do something that's like a lot of people are in CogSci, and they're not like doing any computer programming. You have to understand what's happening in machine learning. But for many of us, we can understand it at a theoretical, philosophical level, because that's all we need for the work we're doing.
Right.
So,
gotcha.
Yeah. So there's what I'm saying is there's considerable variation in how computational your approach to CogSci has to be. And some of the programs that lean more towards the 4E CogSci have reduced the computational demands they place on their students. So look around a lot is what I want to say. Like I think Andy Clark's thing in Edinburgh is several of my students have gone on there as graduate students. Is not so mathy. I think the one here at Carleton, the graduate program in cognitive science, is also not quite so computational. Definitely, I'm not as sure about the Carleton one, but I think that's the case. I'm quite sure about the one in Edinburgh around Andy Clark. So look around more.
Right. Got it.
The variation, and also, who's going to be your supervisor is also going to be really important for how mathy you'll need to be. Right.
Okay, I'll make sure to look around then. So we're about the 1 hour mark, so it's a good place to end. And I would just like to say that I'm so grateful for your work. Like, it's really ineffable how much meaning I've gotten out of it. And I think this is even more impressive because when I already found your work, I already was, into psychology, into philosophy. Some of the things you said, I already had intimations of it, but the way you put everything together and how scientific it was for me was really eye-opening. And your approach and your work, it's something that I'm trying to replicate. And I'm not as knowledgeable or as smart as you, but I'm, in the way that I'm trying to embody that in my small circle.
Well, you're also a lot younger than me, right? So
yes.
Give yourself some time, right? You're talking to somebody who's been working at this for like both academically and non-academically. Like I've been doing the meditation and Tai Chi for like 30 years, and I've been in the academic world for even longer, right? So give yourself time too, right? Like it takes time. It's just like you'll be in a place probably beyond me when you get to my age. I'm already seeing my students, starting to surpass me in important ways. And I don't mean that in any kind of begrudgment. That's what you want to see. So give yourself time. You're going to get there. You're going to get there.
Thank you. So yeah, like if you happen to have time to, if you have interest of chatting again, because
I commit to you now. If you ask me and we'll work out a time, I'll definitely come back. I found you
Awesome.
articulate. I found you very articulate, and I found you very responsive, and you were doing the genuine, not just interviewing, you were actually challenging in a respectful, dialectical way. I found your take on my work clear and even helpful to me to hear. Yeah, I loved this. I would love to do this again.
Awesome. Perfect. That means a lot. Thank you so much.
In fact, if you could send me this file, I'd like to upload it to Voices with Vervaeke and put it on as Voices with Vervaeke episode.
Awesome. That would be amazing. I would definitely do that.
So yeah, email me any information, links to your podcast you want me to put in when you send me the file, because I very much would like to share this with other people. Because one of the topics you brought up, I felt you were doing throughout this discussion, is that you were trying to bridge between sort of the very technical, right, language, that you rightly say I use, and people's, ongoing experience. And I thought that was very helpful. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So, okay, so that's it. And thank you very much. And I hope to chat with you again sometime.
I count on it. So just
Awesome.
we'll make it happen.
Perfect.
Take good care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.